Hi there, Marjorie Dagnall here in California, saying hello to all of you out there and reminding each of us that there is just an expanded awareness of here. So in that expanded awareness, there's only one spiritual universe, and so we're all together in one place, even though it doesn't seem to be that way. I always think of the day of Pentecost, where the disciples met with Jesus, but they came together to be together, not at all. It was because they were together that they came together in that same spirit that Jesus left them with. So there was no leaving, there was just the sameness. And the disciples, because they were together, came together. This kind of thinking is what we're going to be doing today. And you probably guessed that already, because the title, for granted, is a little bit unusual. 3 strings and 4 dimensions. It's certainly fair to ask, whatever does that mean? What's she talking about, anyway? And I definitely am hoping that it's only the title that you're going to be wondering about, and not the rest of the talk. Anyway, we're in now this wonderful sense of September, past into the 1st of October, and most of the school children have finished their essays, what I did this summer. A teacher friend of mine had a very intriguing version of this question. He asked, "What were you thinking this summer?" Well, I didn't write the essay, but I knew the answers, because I had been thinking very clearly about 4 things that kept going through my mind, 4 specific experiences. One of them was that of Isaac Perlman. The second was that of a slideshow. The third was that of Bach B minor bass. And then there were 2 more, really. An ungiven talk, and then I'm going to add a 5th, and that was the day from hell. It's all pretty intriguing stuff, and I think it's all really much the same thing. Some of you might be aware of the most interesting story, which is credited as appearing in the Houston Chronicle many years ago. It was a report of a concert given by Isaac Perlman, the virtuoso violinist, in New York City. The account described how Mr. Perlman, who, as some of you might know, was afflicted with polio when he was just a young child, and movement for him is extraordinarily difficult. So he walked very carefully and painfully and slowly across the stage with braces and crutches. And that night, he put down the crutches, took off the braces, and began to play in the usual fashion. As he played, however, there was a loud snap, like a gunshot, as one of the violin strings broke. The orchestra stopped playing, everybody got really quiet, and of course all eyes were on Mr. Perlman to see what was going to happen. Would someone come out and give him a second violin? Would he reach into some case and replace the broken string? Well, he did neither of those things. Actually, according to the report, what he did was the following, and I quote, "He waited a moment, closed his eyes, and signaled the conductor to begin again. The orchestra began, and he played from where he had left off. And he played with such passion and such power and such purity as they had never heard before. Of course, anyone knows that it's impossible to play a symphonic work with just 3 strings. I know that. You know that. But that night, Isaac Perlman refused to know that. You could see him modulating, changing, and recomposing the piece in his head. When he finished, there was an awesome silence in the room. And then people rose and cheered. There was an extraordinary outburst from every corner of the auditorium. He smiled, wiped the sweat from his brow, raised his bow to quiet the audience, and not boastfully, but in a quiet, reverent way, said, "You know, sometimes it is the artist's task to find out how much music you can still make with what you have." Such an interesting and provocative comment. So much so that the writer of the article went on to add, perhaps that this is the way of life, not just for an artist, but also for all of us, to find out how much music we can play with what we have left. I wonder how many of us feel as though we are playing with what we have left of our understanding, of our energy, even sometimes of our faith. The events of recent years seem to tell us that they have made us a little bit off balance. We struggle at times to keep clear about the world and national affairs, and certainly about our own experiences. Sometimes those experiences can seem, just like Mrs. Eddy said, those interlaced ambiguities that we have to deal with. When needing to make a decision about what to do, Mr. Perlman elected to keep playing with 3 strings. He didn't leave the stage. He didn't wait for a new violin. He didn't wait for a repair of strings. And I'm interested and curious about why he did that. Maybe it was to see if he could do it. Maybe it was just to see how much music he could play with what he had left. Or maybe something caused him to see himself differently. At that moment, to see the situation differently. Or maybe to interpret it differently. Now, this is not particularly new for all of us. Every one of us here have had moments when we saw with great clarity something differently than we had seen before. And because of that vision, we acted differently. Often those moments come when we feel like we were suddenly cut off from something, as Mr. Perlman was. Some loss. Sometimes we felt we were playing with just 3 strings, that indeed one of our strings was broken. Or even worse, that we were nothing more than a broken string. And yet, as Mr. Perlman, we were able to rise above the event, the experience, the situation, to soar o'er time and space, as our hymn says, in the timeless atmosphere of spirit. At such moments, we seem to reach beyond the usual limits and conditions which we assume to be man's limited capacity. And at those moments, we realize a dimension beyond, fetterless and free. It is this limitless spontaneity of thought which is the 4th dimension of spirit. It is the ever-presence of divine, unrestricted intelligence, the awareness of and the analyzation are beyond the physical senses. Mrs. Eddy writes all about this in Miscellaneous Writings on page 22. You've read it before. She says, Christian Science translates mind, God, to mortals. And then she says, it is the infinite calculus defining the line, the plane, the space, and the 4th dimension of spirit. Now, when we become aware of this operation, it's sometimes quite difficult to describe what we've seen or felt. The normal 3 dimensions of our language, of our thinking, are gone. And we identify ourselves in some other way. Perhaps we have become the, quote, conscious, most imbued, the consciousness most imbued, as she says in the message of '01, which struggles to articulate itself. It struggles because the old parameters are not relevant anymore, and thought is free to express itself in new ways. Much like catching a glimpse of the new heaven and the new earth. At any rate, I think Mr. Perlman played not with what he had left, but what he always had. The music, after all, is not in the string, but in the mind that has always brought it forth. When what appears to be a sudden loss is correctly seen, the operation of spirit has begun. It has begun to adjust our viewpoint so that we can continue seeing what is eternally true and not what our physical senses are reporting. Our hymn reminds us, when all material streams are dry, the fullness, thy fullness is the same. Might it be that Mr. Perlman's modulating the passages to accommodate 3 strings was really modulating the thought to accommodate the fullness of the music's complete fullness and its uninterrupted harmony? Perhaps what caused Mr. Perlman to continue playing was the fact that while the string was broken, the divine law of completeness was not. It was only a material sense of things that aggressively suggested that the music could be stopped. Who or what can stop the idea which presents itself as music? It is always present. And Mr. Perlman, who, by the way, has reported that he sees sound rather than notes, understood this. He understood the continuity of the sound presenting itself as music. He understood that it could not be interrupted by the breaking of a string. It's somewhat like numbers in the mathematical system, isn't it? The number 7, for instance, is an idea in the system. We have a symbol for 7, which we use to designate this particular idea. If we were to print a large 7 on a sheet of paper, and then if we were to stamp on it, or tear it up, or paint over it, we would have done nothing to the idea. The symbol might be messed up, but 7 goes on uninterrupted. It has not been altered nor changed in any way. I love to think about this when cherishing that wonderful discourse that John tells us in his Gospel of Jesus, instructing us that he is the true vine. I used to think of that as true, as opposed to false. But in one of those moments we earlier mentioned, I understood that Jesus was telling us that he was the actual, not the symbol. That regardless what was done to the symbol, it could in no way touch the reality of the actual. He was the actual man, not the counterfeit, not the symbol. No matter what was done to this so-called material body, the symbol could not change his being, the actual, in any way. In continuing to think about this, we might rightfully ask, what is it that moves us beyond the confines of our limited thinking? Why, on some occasions, has each of us done this? Certainly, I don't know the answer, any more than I can explain why, after many days of prayer, a healing takes place, when it becomes a reality to us, even though it had been there all along, but we hadn't seen it. We hadn't recognized it. And then suddenly, it became apparent to us. Well, we might say, well, these kinds of situations happen to us in the extremity, when we've reached the bottom, when we can't hold out any longer. And our textbook says, man's extremity is God's opportunity. But God does not need opportunity. God is opportunity. Divine action is not dependent on a mortal or a material circumstance in any way, nor does God withhold the infinity of his being until man finds himself in some awful predicament, or until he gets himself okay, and somehow or another he thinks he can finally accept the good that is being offered to him. Perhaps he's suffered enough. Perhaps he's just tired of it, like the man who's sick of the palsy. But infinite good does not cooperate with suffering or evil or extremity. This wonderful statement of our leader shows us that it needs no sudden sallies, as she says, to provide it. Man's opportunity is always present. The extremity is man's opportunity, not God's. Perhaps Mr. Perlman saw this opportunity, and he took it. It was, therefore, opportunity, not extremity, that he responded to. And there appeared to be no resistance to accepting this. After all, truth leads us, error does not. The imperative is always on the side of good. Truth is always urging on mortals its resisted claims, as our textbook says. And what was the opportunity? The opportunity was to keep going. To keep going, knowing that what he needed was present and that it was not dependent on him. Now, as we think about Mr. Perlman and his just going on, we could rightfully surmise that he had faith in himself because he'd been in sticky situations before, and he came through them. So we might think that it was some of his experiences which led him to have that courage or curiosity or whatever it was that kept him going. It's a very common belief. We're all aware of it. We've heard it many times. We've said it. Well, we hear people say, well, it was a real tough experience, but I got through it and it made me what I am. Absolutely not. We are not made through or by our experiences. We are what we are, as our beloved Paul says. We are what we are through the grace of God. It is God who gives us our nature. After all, we are the image and likeness of God, are we not? Where does experience come into that? There's no experience necessary to be the image of God. We're not the products of the things that happen to us. We do not do what we do or be what we be because of what happened to us in the 3rd grade, or high school, or yesterday, or even today. We must look beyond these fading pictures of ourselves, and we look beyond what we have been told, beyond the physical senses and the material senses, beyond the 3 dimensions of our world, to find identification beyond our current measure. It seems to me that the only way we can articulate or show forth that which is imbued in consciousness is through living it. It is articulated in our lives, for us and as we reach beyond the pale limits of false sense of reality. After all, we live the ideas we entertain. Now, this reminds me of a delightful experience that a friend of mine had. He told me that he was in a position to help an educational program which he believed had great merit. He was going to present this program at the breakfast meeting of the Junior Chamber of Commerce. And he felt that if they could see the merits of this program, they might financially support it. So after securing a spot on the program at the group's breakfast meeting, he approached the instructor of the school and asked him to send a teacher and some slides so that he could show their program to the members. So on the morning of the breakfast, the teacher arrived just as the meeting was about to begin. So my friend greeted him and asked for the slides as the projector was set up and ready for action. The teacher announced that he had no slides and that he wasn't going to give the talk, and he was there for support. My friend took a deep breath. While this was certainly not the equivalent of a broken string, it certainly felt like it to my friend at that moment. Understanding the situation, a man in charge of the projector said he'd just go put it away. It wouldn't be needed. But my friend heard himself say, "No, leave it." Now at that point, my friend felt a certain quietude in his consciousness, perhaps a calm resolve. I'm certainly not sure what he felt, but I know that what he did was absolutely delightful. Not only did he give the talk spontaneously, he used the non-existent slides to make his point. He simply asked for slide number 1, and then he began to explain what was happening on that slide. When somebody finally called out, "But there's no slide in the projector," he replied, "Well, of course there's not. You have to imagine it. Now, next slide, please." He said he talked about different slides, explaining each one. At one point, he looked out and saw the audience all staring at the upper right-hand corner of the blank slide that he was pointing to. And of course, there was nothing there. Yet every one of those people was involved in creating their own scenario of that program, based not on the content of the slide, but on what they heard it being said. Mr. Perlman heard a string break, and he continued to make music. My friend saw no slides, and yet he continued to use them to present the program. Might that not be what each of us does in every experience? Is it not our nature that determines the experience? Is it not up to each of us to use our own nature to perceive what is going on? When viewing beyond that blank slide that is being presented to us? In this situation, each imagined the contents of that slide based on what he was being told. He saw them and asked them to use their imagination. But we can change imagination to image. And when we image forth instead of imagine, then our God-given experiences, far more than three-dimensional, present themselves. It's when we stop imagining what it is like and we become the actual image of what it is like that we begin to see a new dimension. Mr. Perlman was hearing beyond something his physical senses were telling him. He was playing by this hearing. My friend was telling the audience something beyond what he knew. And they were both articulating beautifully with what they had left. 3 strings, a projector, and the 4th dimension of spirit took care of a broken string, missing slides, no preparation time, no prepared text, and even no involvement with the program. How exciting is this? The knowledge that something is going on beyond what we perceive in our 3-dimensional world, and that is going on in everyday affairs like this simple talk to the Chamber of Commerce. Now, of course, we're all well aware of these happenings because they're noted in scriptures all the time. Jesus appeared to his disciples twice in rooms where the door was locked. In the Transfiguration, he talked with Moses and with Elias. He fed the 5,000 with a few loaves of bread and a few fishes. He was instantly on the shore when he needed to be, and he was instantly out of the throng that was after him. But it wasn't just Jesus. Peter was led out of the prison by an angel, and so on. The servant of Elisha saw the horses and chariots round about Elisha. We know all about how the water was turned into wine, but we also know how the oil was magnified to save individuals. On and on and on. We see and hear these in Scripture. The wonderful thing is that Mrs. Eddy saw these things and took them seriously. She did not delegate them to a category called miracle or to something that just happened out of the blue. She recognized that they articulated some lawful activity beyond what we were able to cognize, and that this activity was law. The burning bush was not destroyed, not necessarily because of an attempt to get Moses' attention, but because there was a law in operation. And that law of operation insisted that no destruction take place. But it was ready to be seen. That law presented itself to Moses because it had to be seen. Now, Mrs. Eddy herself received the revelation of truth from beyond the 3 dimensions of thought. This revelation was present, ready to be recognized. But it took a thought unencumbered with personal sense to receive it. But the point is simply that it is not beyond comprehension that our present living includes a conscious awareness of life in and of the fourth dimension of spirit, and that as we accept its possibilities, we will see its manifestations. I've enjoyed the following quote from a fellow Christian Scientist talking about activity and in the fourth dimension. He said, "In the present state of mortal thought, we must of course be modest in our claims to understand and use the fourth dimensions of spirit. Yet, we can all begin by refusing to believe that supply, substance, healing, thinking, or any other good can be limited to 3 dimensions and a visible world. We can realize that the objects of the present dream world, necessary as they may be for temporary use, are only poor counterfeit presentations of the real objects which we shall fully know." End of quote. Well, there's nothing holding us back, is there? I mean, we have seen that what propels us is our own expanding awareness of completeness. Our completeness reflects the completeness of the entire universe. The whole picture is from the divine, isn't it? From the calculus of truth and spirit operating despite the flesh, operating through its own modes and its own channels, doing its own work, establishing truth, and uncovering the belief that there is something beside itself. And of course, we see this in the events of our lives. Maybe not to the degree that we'd like, but we are making room for it. There is opportunity. Mrs. Eddy gives us this piece of knowledge in Miscellany, which is so hope-giving. She says, "Whatever needs to be done, which cannot be done now, love prepares the way for." And so let's take a look at something else that I thought about this summer, and that's Bach's B minor Mass. I have long loved this work. I sold my bicycle when I was 10 to purchase a recording of it. It has long been a close companion of mine. But for the first time this summer, I realized that this work was never performed in Bach's lifetime, and that he never had any hope that it would ever be performed. Indeed, it was not performed until 100 years after he died. Yet, he lovingly worked on it over his lifetime, not really adding new music, but reworking the themes that he used. And I think these might have been themes that he really loved, and he borrowed them from his other works. But I thought about what drove him to keep working on this, making it better and better for years, knowing that no one would ever hear it. And then, quite suddenly, I realized how incredibly wrong that conclusion was. Of course, it would be heard, because surely Bach wrote this in the fourth dimension, and there it was performed, and there it was heard. It was only when I insisted on seeing it in a limited, three-dimensional atmosphere of thought that I saw it as curious or even sad. Yet the demand, if you will, of the music itself, of the completeness of that music, that it be heard, was in operation. The idea and the manifestation of the idea can never be separated, nor can they ever deviate from their original purpose. These are things that we don't pay much attention to, and we're not particularly interested in them. They seem to be a bit out of our ordinary way of thinking, something that perhaps we'll understand later, or when we get to be a little bit more pure in our thinking, or absolute. But when our string breaks, or when the slides don't arrive, or when we had a hellish day, we're able to carry on, just as we heard, because those truths in the universe of spirit are always there. They undergird reality. And just because we can't see them doesn't mean that they're not there. When we begin to trust the invisible more than the visible, the invisible becomes our reality, and we see it more clearly. As we unself, as we reach beyond the limits of our own shallow thought, we realize a new heaven and a new earth every day. And why not? One day, a few months ago, I had what many Christian scientists would describe as a challenging day. I would describe it as the day from hell. I won't describe it because it's all a lie anyway. But it seems so real as one after another things seem to go awry. Really awry. I didn't even reverse any of this when I went to bed at night. I just went to bed and covered my head. In the middle of the night, I woke up and seemed quite alert. I fixed a cup of tea and I sat quietly in my bedroom. I wasn't rehearsing the things of the day. I didn't want to go there. But quite clearly, I heard a voice in my consciousness say, "Oh, this has been such a lovely day." Well, I knew for sure that that was not my voice, and certainly not my evaluation. But I didn't argue. I didn't say, "Yeah, little do you know. Let me tell you about it." I quickly realized that I was being called to a higher dimension of thought and an entirely new way of thinking about my day. I saw that, yes, soul was having a lovely time with mind, and principle was having a lovely time with love, and spirit was, oh, so happy with life, and on and on. And I actually saw that indeed it was a lovely day. I was viewing it from an entirely different standpoint. And this change in view changed my experience. For several days, I saw the synonyms working together, right where the material was showing itself. Right there, in that very place where the material was aching to be seen, so to speak, the synonyms were working together in peace and harmony. For example, I went to pick up my youngster from school, and I passed through a section of road which is always beautiful. The branches of the redwoods and the other trees form a canopy overhead. But this time, and for several days, I saw the canopy in a different way. I saw soul forming an alliance with life, beauty bearing witness to freshness and vitality. And I arrived at the school, and I began the process of picking him up, it looked very much like a line of cars, a 20-minute process, a very hot day. That's what it looked like. But I began to see it as mind's intelligence, having a lovely time with principles, organization, and so on. All I could see was the synonyms working together to form a successful pickup of a young child. When this new way of discernment came, it brought forth no resistance, as I mentioned. There was no self arguing for its perception, its memory, its misery. No self willingly insisting on rehearsing error. No self satisfying its own ego. It came with its own willingness to be accepted. Soul has infinite resources with which to bless mankind. But it is soul that blesses mankind, not us. We are not the medium through which God works. God needs no medium. So often, we want to be the middleman, the one that does the good, that knows the truth, that provides the solution, that is the all-time great healer. And so in our zeal, we actually think that we can be these things. And by golly, sometimes we can. Yet Jesus said, "Of mine own self, I can do nothing." We tend to think that, yeah, we know that. But God channels his goodness and his will to us, and we do the work. But is that so? Man is not a medium. God is not separate from the wisdom he bestows. God is the action, substance, and all of each and every one of those bestowals that soul is bringing to us. Maybe that is what Mr. Perlman knew on some level. Maybe that's what my friend knew. Maybe that's what Bach knew. Once in a while, I even know it. One time, I traveled to a distant city to give a talk to a Christian Science organization. And I prepared this talk prayerfully and lovingly. And I was invited to meet with the group immediately before my talk. They were having a business meeting, trying to determine what action that they would take. And while I listened, I began to realize that while the talk that I was about to deliver was metaphysically sound, and it said all kinds of nice things, it didn't really address the issues that were of deep concern to the organization at the time. As such, the talk really, in my thought, didn't appear to be particularly helpful. And I became increasingly aware that perhaps I needed to be open to new ideas and fresh insights as the speaker. Obviously, those thoughts were not in my laboriously prepared talk. As I was being introduced, I was debating what to do, perhaps as Mr. Perlman did. While my string was not broken, I certainly didn't feel as though I could continue playing the music which I had selected. I calmly told the audience of my thinking, and I asked that we be quietly prayerful for a few minutes, after which I closed the prepared text, leaned on the lantern, and began to speak. At that time, I probably would have given anything for those blank slides that my friend used. Anything to focus my thought. I didn't have a clue what I would say or where the talk was going to go. But you know what? I really didn't have to. Because as I began to talk, I suddenly realized that I didn't need a new talk. I just needed to see the old talk from a new viewpoint. I found that the ideas from the ungiven talk outlined themselves in my thought in a newly arranged order. I spoke for over an hour and a half as the talk began to transform itself into a solution. Ideas began to flow quickly and reasonably. Everything that was needed was already there. It just presented itself in a new way, and I accepted it. The opportunity was there. It wasn't the extremity of the situation. It was the opportunity that was present. Needless to say, those of us involved all remember that day as a day of resolution and inspiration. And the talk was of enormous benefit to all of us, and to me especially, because I reached beyond anything I knew to focus on that which mind knew. And as we end part of today's talk, we can hear one more thing from Mr. Perlman. He later elaborated on what was reported to be his initial statement after playing with a broken string by saying nearly the same thing, but in a different way. He said, "Perhaps our task in this shaky, fast, changing, bewildering world in which we live is to make music at first with all that we have, and then, when that is no longer possible, to make music with what we have left." Making music with what one has left, it seems to me, is a very good thing. Because what is left has been refined. It's no longer possible to play with what one had before. Because such refinement no longer throws itself with great passion and zeal into the vain dreams of a material world and of personal sense. The divine nature of man begins to shine forth more clearly as he welcomes the purity, the restraint, and the temperance of the unselfed life, which our leader talks about in the very first sentence of our textbook. And then again in our textbook, she instructs us that, quote, "Whatever holds thought in line with unselfed love receives directly the divine power." Let's remember that the appearance of truth is always in spite of the human. It is never because of the human mind. What we call the appearing of truth is really the disappearing of some of the mist of ignorance. Because all the truth that there is here anyway. Now, let's take a word, is. Let's look at that for a minute. Is is really science, it seems to me. Truth is. Health is. Consciousness is. Abundance is. If we allow that, if we say, oh yes, to it, it begins to reason us out of mortality. It reasons us out of it. Truth is reasoning itself. And in reasoning itself, it reasons us out of error. We don't reason ourselves out of error. Truth operates in human experience through the correlative of spirit. To correct, to alter, to ameliorate, to be whatever is necessary to vindicate the allness of truth. The allness of truth shows us a completed concert, a completed slideshow, a completed mass, a completed talk, and even a completed day in its complete evaluation. Now, often in the lesson, we have the Galatians reference to the fruit of the Spirit. You remember it says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. I've often looked at that with the sense of the last shall be first, because I concluded that temperance is the first and most important, even though it is given last. When the light of Christian Science reality first dawns on us, it often brings great passion. And we're filled with enormous love, as well we should. We want to heal everything, everywhere, immediately. But we begin to see that this love demands to be understood and demonstrated as divine love, not human, as the actual, not the symbol. So we find it harder and harder to manipulate, and easier to let God control. We find it harder to trust our own will, knowing that human will is tenuous, tedious, and often treacherous. We begin to commence, to start, to learn the actual meaning of all those fruits of the Spirit, all of those qualities. And as we do, we begin to appreciate and value temperance. I think that the important thing for us to do and to see and to understand is that our own completeness is moving upon us all the time, demanding that truth is always urging us, always moving us completely. Now, in a few moments, I'm going to read a poem by Max Dunaway, Neophyte. Would you give it, Lori? That says this very, very clearly. And before I do that, I would really like to be able to take a few moments to start to review what we have said here in this time together. Because we started with a violinist who reportedly took the opportunity of a broken string in his concert to continue playing by using the 3 strings that were left. Then number 2, we determined that because, as Mrs. Eddy has taught us, Christian Science translates mind, God, to mortals as the infinite calculus defining the line, plane, space, and 4th dimension, the presence and power of this dimension showed itself as the law of completeness, which never has been nor could be broken. Hence, the violinist was translating the broken back into the unbroken. Soaring over time and space is something not that unique that many of us know and many experience. However, that when the normal 3 dimensions are thought to be the absolute limits, the consciousness which pushes past those limits struggles to articulate itself. And now, at point number 5, we can see that it can only articulate itself through the life that sees it. Hence, it must be evidenced through living. It was only a material sense of things which aggressively suggested a broken string, and that broken string could stop the music, which was not in the string, but in the mind which created it, and cannot be stopped. And now we're at point number 7, that numbers, like notes, start with principle. The symbols might be messed up, but the actual is never touched by the symbol, as Jesus showed us when he presented himself as the true vine. The actual, not the symbol. And then, point number 8, that our experiences really do not form or mold us, because our natures are given to us of God. We take our nature into our experience, so to speak. Our experience does not cause our nature. And 9, that opportunity, not extremity, leads us into all truth. We also saw that the blank slides that we call us reflect the divine when we image ourselves after God's likeness, rather than imagine ourselves to be that likeness. And then 11, that biblical scripture gives us numerous examples of 4th dimensional experiences. That our beloved leader was led by this dimension of spirit to recognize and understand that they were not out of the blue. They were not experiences called miracles, but the actual presence of law. 13, that we can cherish and reach forth for those laws by refusing to believe that supply, substance, healing, thinking, or any good thing can be limited to 3 dimensions by our customary thinking. And then point 14, the hope-giving one, that whatever needs to be done but cannot be done now, love prepares the way for. And then point 15. That while we don't pay much attention to the things that we've talked about today, we have said that their presence is always available to be seen. And when we begin to see and trust the invisible, it becomes more visible to us. And then, point number 16, that the evaluation of the day from hell was done away with by the overriding thought of mind's measurement, and a lovely day showed itself as the new heaven and the new earth. Two more points. One, that unselfing evidence man's nature, which shows the fruits of the spirits as moving, this fruit of the spirit, as moving from passionate love to temperate righteousness. I love that. So I'm going to say it again. That unselfing evidence man's nature, which shows the fruits of the Spirit as moving from passionate love to temperate righteousness. 18, that this temperance shows that the gates of hell fall of their own accord. And that's what we're going to present right now. In this wonderful poem that Max Dunaway wrote, that shows us so clearly what it takes to be able to move from passionate love to that wonderful sense of righteousness. Max Dunaway wrote a poem called Neophyte. Some of you might know it. Some of you probably haven't heard it in a long time. But it's a pretty interesting statement. He says, "When first the dawn burst on his sight, he felt his being filled with light. He looked at all before him spread and vowed that he would raise the dead, wrench gates of hell from off their bars, and laugh and fling them to the stars. The years passed. No dead were raised. No mighty wonders, man appraised, rewarded him. Hell's gates remained, unshaken by hopes once constrained. The light still shone, but with less fire than flamed his ardent first desire. His thoughts turned to the little deeds, the common tasks of meeting needs. He lifted up a fallen child and wiped her tears until she smiled. He helped a tired and burdened crone, someone whom he had never known. He sat beside a dying friend and gave him courage till the end, then sought to soothe the aching heart of her who felt grief's sting and smart, to say a word, to put forth a hand, or just be still and understand. And years of living to be kind brought greater love and peace of mind. He learned to serve within his place, growing in gentleness and grace, and being forgotten. The gates of hell, in their own weakness, toppled and fell. And what was left? a new heaven and a new earth. That which we call the fourth dimension. Without sin, without sickness, without discouragement, without dismay, without death, without anything that does not come from God. So there we have it. It's not the essay that was done this summer, but it is the exploration of what thought was this summer. 4 things helping to explain 4 dimensions, and 3 strings helping to get us there. Lots of love, and thank you.